I want to welcome you to today's book launch. I'm Mary Conley. I'm the chair of the History Department, and I was delighted to be asked in part by Tom Worcester and Tom Landy to start today's event. We're here to celebrate the publication of the Cambridge Encyclopedia of the Jesuits, which was edited, the main editor was our colleague Tom Worcester, and which included many of the folks who are here today as well. We want to thank the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture for sponsoring this event and making it possible to bring the associate editors, Jim Corkery and Alison Fleming, here today. And it was really important for us to host this event. While we celebrate Tom's new endeavors as president of Regis College in Toronto, and we recognize that he lives in Toronto, not Worcester, we still claim him as our colleague in our community. And he still is part of our history department. So, and much of this project has come to fruition here at Holy Cross. He's been at the college, our college, for over 20 years. And in the years that I've worked with him, I have witnessed his energy at editing several volumes on church and Jesuit history and European history. Notably, he was editor of the Cambridge Companion to the Jesuits, and he co-edited four books, including the Papacy since 1500 that he produced with Jim Corkery, who's here today. We know Tom is a cultural historian of early modern France, and as a historian of Europe who's moved to church history and to the history of the Papacy. And so it's really quite fitting that he was charged to help produce this book. I'm sure that Regis College is going to celebrate this volume. But as I said, I think it's apt that we do it here. Not only because it's a work of the Jesuits, which is intimately tied to our own identity as a college, but because this work was conceived here, because it was made possible by the college, and because it was produced in collaboration with scholars at Holy Cross. The college is distinguished by its reputation for great teaching and scholarship, and it has given support and time for faculty to create. And this is an example of that creation. His research, Tom's research, was supported by leaves, made possible by funds, particularly given by one of our most favorite alums and trustees, Neil Pryor, who wanted to honor Holy Cross's Reverend Maurice Reedy. And it was that time away and those reduced course schedules that allowed him to edit such a big volume. The college also provided fertile ground for him to find companions in action or collaborators in action from his associate editors like Jim Corkery and Alison Fleming, who he met here at Holy Cross and had time serving here teaching at Holy Cross, to 7 current faculty, 4 members of the history department, 7 members of the religious studies department, and I just want to note them. Bill Clark, Matt Eggemeyer, Peter Fritz, John Gavin, our late colleague Tony Kuzniewski, Alice Laffey, Father Vincent Lapramarda, Joanne Pierce, Justin Pochet, and Bill Reiser. It also includes, notably, several history major alums of our college, and so I need to note them, including Tom Murphy, professor of American history from Seattle University, and Brent Otto, who is one of my students and is a Jesuit and a current PhD student at Berkeley. It also includes John Padberg, who was the former director of the Institute of Jesuit Sources and who received an honorary degree here. So we celebrate this book because it represents collaboration in this quest for knowledge and greater understanding of the Jesuits. And so that effort is to be applauded. I wanted to say a couple words. I spent the weekend looking and reading through this book. It's more than an A to Z of the Jesuits, though it does follow that traditional classification of an encyclopedia from A to Z, from Jose de Acosta the Jesuit to Domenico Zipoli. It has Jesuits and non-Jesuits. It has anti-Jesuits, like Jansenist Antoine Arnaud. And this is a project that features individuals. It's not a compendium of biographies. It features places and regions across the globe where Jesuits moved and worked. It discusses institutions started by and associated with Jesuits, like the Pontifical Biblical Institute, the JVC, and colleges and institutions like Holy Cross. And as someone a bit unfamiliar with many Catholic and Jesuit practices and beliefs, for me this was a really approachable guide to all things Jesuit. It provides an engaging way to understand what Jesuit beliefs are. It gives entries on the liturgy, on the role of the liturgy in preaching, on the distinctive stages of Jesuit formation, on concepts like indifference and mental reservation, which I found enjoyable to read. It provides an explanation of the meaning of AMDG, Ad Majorem Dei Gloriam. It explains the Sacred Heart, something to me that when I encountered the Sacred Heart on a trip that I made to Montserrat with Allison, I always wondered, what is the Sacred Heart? Well now, aside from Googling it, I can read it in Tom's encyclopedia. So it gives us the spiritual exercises, it gives us the examen, but it also gives us things we may not expect. It gives us dance, it gives us music, as well as other arts, ways that we can begin to understand how Jesuits thought about how the Spirit could be incarnated. It's a sweeping history, which you can read entries on India and China, but then there are also these micro-histories of certain practices. It's a global history that gives us a sense of actual physical networks of Jesuits and how they moved across the world, how Marquette moves from France to Canada to the Mississippi. It gives us intellectual networks that we may not, as someone who's starting out, can really begin then to understand the connections between Coran or Korea to Pedro Erupe. So it's a really engaging way to encounter Jesuit history. It's also a history that encounters and reckons with its past in honest ways. It's not a hagiography of all things Jesuit, and I think that's to be commended. It's got passages on Jesuit scandals. It has passages on the suppression. And Worcester also includes passages that recognizes the Jesuit history in supporting colonial powers in the Americas. It reckons with Jesuit history of enslaving humans and that sordid connection with educational missions of colleges. And it even has entries on the sexual abuse crisis in the early 21st century that came to light. So in telling this full history, Worcester offers us an excellent history of the Jesuits as an encyclopedia. He brings integrity to this full history, allows us to understand Jesuit heritage. It shows us cleavages and complexities and challenges and a really, really rich, strong history. He shows us an institution that is organic, that changes, and like in all things in history, will continue to change, and yet has integrity. So with that introduction, let me introduce Tom, who will begin our day of launching the book.
Thank you. That almost seemed like a beatification proceeding. This project has been a lot of work, but also a very interesting one. It's the biggest project I've ever done. I can say that without any hesitation at all. It makes doing a doctoral dissertation look like child's play, and a lot of other things as well. When I interviewed for the job I currently hold in Toronto, the question came up of my previous administrative experience. And I said, well, I think the most significant I have is as general editor of an encyclopedia. Let me tell you about that. So I went on for some length about issues of planning and budgeting and deadlines and personnel. There were 110 authors that completed entries. There could have been a few more. Some did not complete entries. Various difficulties along the way. Some might say it was a herding cats exercise. In any case, I went on about this, and there was a dead silence in the room. And I thought, well, I guess I didn't get this job. And then someone spoke up and said, oh, being president of Regis will be easier than that. Everyone laughed as you did. We moved on, and I realized 2 seconds later, I have the job. This is a collaborative project, as Mary Conley pointed out. It's not something that I've done alone. It wasn't even my idea in terms of recognizing people who have contributed. Cambridge University Press had the idea. They contacted me, asked me if I might be interested in doing such a thing. After some months of consideration, of discernment, as Jesuits would like to say, I signed a contract as far back as 2009. Although I told them I had other projects that I had to finish first, so it didn't really start until 2010-11. Then there was a question of funding, and Father Burroughs responded to my request for help from the college very generously, and as Mary Conley pointed out, in a number of ways that made it possible for this project to happen. So I'd like to acknowledge him here for that. Without that, I don't know if the project would be done or it ever would be done. Again, it's been an enjoyable project. I like collaborative projects. In addition to Alison Fleming and Jim Corkery, there are 2 other associate editors, so I'm the general editor, 4 associate editors. The other 2, Andres Prieto, who is at the University of Colorado, a Chilean, who works on Latin America, who's worked extensively on Jesuits in Latin America, including science and Jesuits in Latin America, so providing really quite a different perspective. And then Megan Armstrong, a historian at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario. Like me, she works on early 17th century France, but she has worked especially on Franciscans, and I thought someone working on a different religious order could help keep us humble and not think Jesuits had invented everything. And that was before Pope Francis was elected. It turned out to be even more felicitous than I thought. Megan will help me do a book launch at Regis on November 8th. In fact, she's just an hour away from Toronto. So many people have helped. Another person who has helped is Henry Schein, and I'd like to introduce him if you could just stand up. He deserves that and more. Henry did a lot of the most difficult work, I would say. That is to say, entries that came in that were in poor shape, poorly written and poor in content and in the wrong length. He did a lot of the work, reworking them. I had first brought him on board especially to do fact-checking, but I realized soon that he could do much, much more than that. He also was very gracious about writing on very short notice entries that were not submitted by others and were needed on a quick deadline. Without him, I don't know if the project would be done now. So I'd just like to acknowledge that. So when I realized all he was doing, Cambridge University Press gave him the title assistant editor, but it's really even more than that. So a lot of people have been involved. Again, as Mary pointed out, many people at Holy Cross among the authors. It's a project that in some ways I'm sorry to see it come to an end, and as delighted as I am to see it come to fruition. Okay. So I could say much, much more, but I'd like to move on to Alison Fleming, art historian, who some of you may know taught for a while at Holy Cross, so more Holy Cross connections. And again, she now is at Winston-Salem State, and she's going to present a short PowerPoint with some of the images. We have 70 images in the encyclopedia. She's going to talk about some of them.
Thank you, Tom. As Tom mentioned, there are 70 images in the encyclopedia. It runs over 900 pages. As you can see, it's quite thick. So 70 images was something that I felt was rather limiting. That was a number that was given to us by Cambridge University Press. As an art historian, I would have preferred that we have an illustration for every single entry, no matter how short, but that was not to be. So I considered myself lucky that we got away with the 70. We had a couple goals and a couple categories for the images. So as we move through and we get to the images, and I'm just showing you a few of them that illustrate some of these general categories that we put in place. We wanted to be very careful of a number of things. First and foremost, we wanted to try and address the chronological span of the society from the 16th century, or really even maybe slightly earlier in some cases, to the present. We didn't want this to be, despite the fact that maybe, okay. So is it working? Let's see. Okay, wonderful, thank you. So we didn't want this to be something that was just about the old society. We didn't want it to be something that was just about today. So we tried to create a sort of chronological breadth. So there are images that date back to the 17th century, images that we may associate with a kind of, European establishment of the society, and some of the early projects, for example, early patronage in a sense of visual culture. But we also wanted to address a global span, so I'm going to show you a couple images that relate to that as well. And then within sort of these broad categories, we wanted to think about the importance of visual culture to the Jesuits. So there are images like this one, which is our beautiful cover image. We were very, very grateful that the Worcester Art Museum was willing to provide us with an image of a work from their collection. So I'm hoping that maybe this is an image that is familiar to some of you. If not, I urge you to head down to the Worcester Art Museum tomorrow morning when they reopen and see this painting. It's a magnificent work, not just in terms of the aesthetics, and it really came out quite well on the cover in terms of a very sumptuous image, but it's also one that illustrates a number of things about the society. It's certainly an image that was important in the context of the life of St. Ignatius. It represents one of his great visions, a vision that he had en route to Rome, in which he is going to stop to pray at this sort of dilapidated chapel just outside of Rome in a little town called La Storta. And he has this vision of God the Father and Christ carrying the cross. Christ says to him, "I will be favorable to you in Rome." And this is a moment, this provides Ignatius with this strength and determination to head to Rome, to meet with the Pope, and subsequently we are going to see the establishment of the order in an official sense in 1540. So this is an important image in many respects and certainly provides a good cover image. Now in that sense, kind of related to the importance of visual culture for the Jesuits, we also are going to see images that are connected to Jesuits who were themselves artists, in addition to, say, other projects that were commissioned by the Jesuits. So Andrea Pozzo, a Jesuit brother in the 17th century, is certainly regarded as one of the foremost artists from the order. He produced a number of projects, really mostly illusionistic frescoes, such as the corridor in the professed house in Rome that you see here, and certainly a great treatise on architecture and painting in perspective that was translated worldwide and enjoyed really sort of a great association of the Jesuits and the arts in the late 17th and early 18th century. We also have more contemporary, sort of modern and contemporary Jesuits who work as artists, a couple of them photographers. So this is perhaps one of my favorite images from the encyclopedia. This is a great story of an Irish Jesuit in the early 20th century, Francis Brown. Has many, many things I could say about him, including his service as a military chaplain during World War I, in which he served on the front lines. He was injured 5 times. He continued in that capacity. But he also, as a high school graduation gift, was given the gift of a camera. And he proceeded to take photographs for his entire life. Over 60 years, he took over 42,000 photographs. And this is probably one of his most celebrated. He had the fortune to have been given a ticket on the inaugural voyage of the Titanic in 1912. He sailed from Southampton to Ireland, and the plan, his ticket was just for that first leg of the journey. The plan was to get off in Ireland. He was apparently very charming, and he met a couple, an American couple on the ship, who offered to pay for his fare to continue on to New York with them, and then his fare to return to Ireland. So when the ship docked in Ireland, he sent a telegram to his provincial asking for permission to do this, and the provincial immediately replied, "Get off that ship." And his orders to return to his normal duties were very, very firm in this case, and according to Brown's biographer, in later years, he often said it was a case of holy obedience saving a man's life. So he is credited with taking one of the very last photographs of the Titanic as it sailed away from Ireland, and also a number of other photographs that he took during the short time he was on the ship photographs of the Marconi room and so forth that other people just didn't happen to take. So it's a great story, and it is a great example of a Jesuit who had a capacity for the visual arts. In a slightly more contemporary sense, Don Dahl is a Jesuit out of Creighton University in Omaha. He is also a photographer. He's worked extensively with Native Americans, published many, many books with great photographs of Native Americans, including this one. He very graciously allowed us to illustrate this with the entry on photography. We also have a kind of another sort of broad category, images of places important to Jesuits. Mary earlier mentioned Montserrat, so we have an image here of the Benedictine Abbey. This was a place that Ignatius traveled to. It is important in the context of his spiritual conversion, his laying down of his sword, his vigil in front of the Black Madonna at Montserrat, his adapting a new set of clothing, in fact, important for his new role in a spiritual life. So there are many, many images of places all around the world such as this that are important to the Jesuits in one way or another, and sort of taking us farther afield, an image from Macau, certainly an important place in terms of the Asian missions. So here we have an architectural ruin of St. Paul's College, a beautiful photograph of what remains after a fire destroyed most of this building. And this is one of many images that we were able to secure to try to explain this global breadth. In that same sense, images, here we have images of some of the Japanese martyrs, although this is actually a painting in St. Francis Xavier Church in New York, recently restored, a beautiful church with lots of wonderful images, including this one, but again, reflecting on this idea of the society reaching out back and forth, the idea of a fresco in New York by a German immigrant artist of the Japanese martyrs in the 19th century, again, sort of transcending global boundaries and different moments in time. We also have, knowing that the encyclopedia images were going to be produced in black and white, with the exception of the cover image, we also tried to find a number of prints. And these reproduce in black and white exceedingly well. So an image like this engraved map of missionary Eusebio Kino is certainly one of those that really comes across quite well visually in the encyclopedia. So this is one of many images that we have, early modern prints. There are some great examples from the Rare Books Library here at Holy Cross, as well as Boston College. This is an image that came to us from the Library of Congress. And it is a wonderful example of a Jesuit who was a missionary, who was a scientist, a cartographer. This is certainly a significant map in the sense that Kino was really the first to determine that Baja California was in fact a peninsula and not an island. So there are many, many wonderful entries about Jesuit contributions to science in many, many respects. And this is one that, again, I think shows us the role of a Jesuit in many respects, the many different things that Kino did, and we have a wonderful image to accompany that. We have a number of what we might call sort of documentary photographs, including many of them that come from the archives of the Society, particularly from the New England province. And we have one here, Jamaica, so again, thinking about the global breadth. And in sort of an additional category, thinking in addition to visual culture and places important to Jesuits, we also have the roles of Jesuits. There are images of them preaching, of teaching, as pilgrims, as missionaries, engaged in all sorts of activities. And so here we see, again, what we might describe, or what the editors often refer to as kind of religion in action. Jesuits engaged in their everyday pursuits. So as much as we may have these kind of magnificent paintings, such as our Baciccio painting on the cover, we also have many illustrations of what might be considered more of a kind of everyday, including an image here on pilgrimage. Let me just say one thing about some of the sources that I've mentioned in a couple cases. Father Worcester did a wonderful job of reaching out not only to our contributors but to other Jesuits around the world to secure many of these images. So we have Jesuits from all corners of the world that were willing to send us photographs such as this one in Kenya, another image that comes to us from a Jesuit in Brazil who I believe is a Holy Cross spread.
He was here in the chapters of this.
Oh, okay. So again, another Holy Cross connection, but really wonderful images that we wouldn't have been able to secure any other way except through this very important network. Again, coming all the way up to the present day, a wonderful image from the very recent visit of Pope Francis to the United States. So again, thinking about sort of the interactions between Jesuits and society at large. Certainly this was a very important event, not just for the society. And then finally, I wanted to end with an image so important for our location. Tom took this wonderful photo that accompanies our entry on the College of the Holy Cross. Certainly what I think many people, including many people in this room, would consider to be one of the most important entries in the encyclopedia.
And so now I'd like to introduce Father Jim Corkery, another Holy Cross connection in a way. He was one of our International Visiting Jesuit Fellows in 2006, both parts of 2006, if my memory is correct, spring and fall of 2006, and then he returned in the fall of 2013. So a total of 3 semesters as an International Fellow here. Currently he's a professor of theology at the Gregorian University in Rome. This project is interdisciplinary, as you can tell. He brings especially a theological perspective, so he's going to tell us some about that.
Thanks, Tom, also Allison and I'll divide my remarks this evening like Gaul into 3 parts. The first, a bit on the experience itself of working together on the project. The second, I'll say something on the place of theology in the Encyclopedia and in the Society of Jesus, and also both on the writing of articles in theology and editing them. And then I'll finish with saying some things that I found out that I didn't know before working on this encyclopedia, and particularly things that surprised me. And I'll finish by saying this is a good thing that Jesuits do, what are the abiding graces? What gifts am I left with from this 7-year journey? So first, a word on the experience itself. You all know that when you choose a profession or a way to live, like early on in my Jesuit training, I passed exams well, but couldn't sing or distinguish myself in the sports field or paint or do anything like that. So they said, you do extra studies and you'll be an academic. And then that unfolded in the usual way. You taught, you administered, you listened endlessly to students, you marked papers and all that. But you didn't know as time passed that other things would happen that would be more interesting in nature. And for me, coming to Holy Cross, meeting Tom, we conceived the first book of essays together that we edited, walking the track after those fine dinners you have in Holy Cross, of which we had every need to walk the track. And we did that first book with Cambridge University Press, and then when he got the call from Cambridge to do the encyclopedia, I was one of the people he invited. And we had worked together before, but the other book was 10 authors and ourselves, very manageable. Suddenly it's going to be 110 authors. I commissioned some 40 in that semester of 2013 when I was here. Others wrote letters commissioning. And when you commission something, you generally follow the author from their saying, what? At the beginning, to the production of their final text at the very end. So it was a huge series of emails with each person, articles of different length. And then, of course, it was interesting also working with a team of 5, which became 6, and in a way which became 7, because the copy editor at the end, Elizabeth Beck, was also a very important person. So for me, The contributors were also not all Jesuits, about 70. The others were men and women with expertise on things Jesuit, well known throughout the world, divided about half and half, the men and the women. I counted, but not too sharply. So to be involved in something like that, and to keep track of it, I'm not a computer expert. When you have version 4 of somebody's article, you want to make sure that you don't send version 1 for final publication in the end. We had to have a way, Tom thought that up, of labeling each article, you know, and when it came in and so on. And amazingly, I don't know about you guys, I'm sure it didn't happen, but I wouldn't be gifted in that area, but nothing got lost. There was a meticulousness and an order. Where would some of that have come from? And a discipline, etc., that worked very well in our working together. But the other thing that was really good was that as a team, we built something that became very enjoyable. Members of the Holy Cross Jesuit community kindly hosted us for some of our meetings. They will remember us down the corridor in a snowstorm on one occasion. We couldn't go out at all, so we got loads of work done. But they will remember the laughter coming out of the room where we were having our meetings. And so that was important also to oiling the wheels of the project. I found myself saying to somebody in conversation the other day, in the end, the things that really matter are relationships. Everything gets done if the relationships are good. Nothing is possible if they're not. So that was very important. Because I'm a theologian, that's what I'm trained in, I commissioned a lot of the articles on theology and edited them. So all my friends in religious studies here suffered under my emails and where are your articles, Bill, where are your articles, etc. So, and also then I edited most of those articles. Theology enjoys a special place in the life of the Society of Jesus, not as I thought when I was young, because we're nerds. Some might be, but principally because when the Society was founded in 1540, it was founded, the first formula of the Institute founding document says, to serve the Lord alone and his vicar on earth. 10 years later, that was updated, and it added that we were to engage in the ministry of defense and propagation of the faith. Now you will remember that was the time of the Reformation. The Society was founded in 1540, and the Council of Trent began in 1545. 4 Jesuits were present at the Council of Trent already, 2 of them as papal theologians, and they there for all sessions, Salmon and Laines, perhaps the most important among them. So from early on, Jesuits were at the center of the theological life of the Church, and in connection with that service of the Lord under the Vicar of Christ, and they contributed a good deal, not only to the documents, in fact, of the Council of Trent, but as an article in the Encyclopedia shows on periti, you know, these theological experts that go to councils, Jesuits were always so heavily present, both in the preparation of, and actually at Vatican I, and especially Vatican II. So that's an interesting article to read. That could give the impression that Jesuit theological activity was always at the center, very close to the Pope and very close to the center of the life of the Church. But this is not so. Because of the missions, I'm thinking China and India specifically, Jesuits going to those countries had to think about questions of the salvation of people who had never heard of Christ or the Church, so that they had to boldly produce not only new theological thinking about salvation previously unthought of, but also to inculturate the faith in different ways. Liturgical experiments and expressions of the faith also through music, images, and so on. So I would say that any expression, be it musical, artistic, architectural, etc., if it's an expression of the Christian faith, it's also doing Christian theology, because it involves theological interpretation. So in the end, something quite good came for Jesuit theologizing. The fact that it occurred on the peripheries and at the center, the fact that it was challenged by new questions in areas previously untrodden by the Christian story, and had to come forward for the papal agenda at times, gives it a kind of a rich, tension that's very fruitful even today. So people are never surprised when they hear the Jesuit theologians say something controversial. They're not always surprised either when they find them standing up vigorously for the Pope. That's a bit easier these days because, let's face it, he thinks like us. Okay, so that's a little word on theology. I could say a lot more. A lot of important names, I have them here on the list. Avery Dulles in their own country, John Courtney Murray, Gustav Weigel, but the Ranners, Henri de Lubac, and I'm just thinking the last century and the present one. Going back, you have interesting figures in the 19th century, that bunch of Spaniards, also Francisco Suarez and others. There were big names, always in Jesuit theologizing, and they are all celebrated in the book. But I want to turn to the last part, because I got the signal from Tom. What surprised me? I just listed a few things. I was surprised, for example, that there were so many Jesuit saints, 54, and blesseds, 146, all of which we know because of Father Vincent Lapomarda's meticulous research on this. I was surprised that overall there had been 43 Jesuit cardinals. Only one of them is a saint. I was surprised that the entry on Film and Television said that no major film had ever been done on Ignatius, or Francis Xavier, or, for example, somebody like Pedro Urrupe. I was surprised to read about a battle of booklets between Galileo Galilei and the Jesuit Orazio Grassi on some of the finer points of the Copernican system, and how, according to the author of that article, Galileo's wit and sarcasm, while making him famous, embarrassed Grassi, often unfairly, and verbally abused also the other Jesuit astronomer Christoph Scheiner. I was surprised, through my own research, I wrote this article, that Pope John Paul II informed Pedro Urrupe, when he was recovering from his stroke, of the placing of the delegate of the Pope's own choice over the Society of Jesus, not directly, but through a letter that was given to him by means of Cardinal Casaroli. I was surprised at the extraordinary story of Juana of Austria, the youngest daughter of the Emperor Charles V and the sister of Philip II, contemporary with Ignatius, who, for various complex political reasons, took vows in the Society of Jesus as a permanent scholastic. And she died as a Jesuit, the only woman ever to have done so. I was surprised, Gemma Simmons' article, I was surprised that the 19th century Jesuit Joseph Kloiken, well known in theology around the time of Vatican I, also is at the centre with another Jesuit of a sordid scandal that, read the book, I was surprised by Joanne Pierce's excellent articles on science fiction, Jesuits in science fiction, and also on the habit. These are the kind of gems in the encyclopedia. You find out things you would never have known. I was surprised that the Canadian theologian Bernard Lonergan smoked a pipe for 30 years. I was surprised that Sophia University, which was begun in Japan and Tokyo in the early part of the second decade of the 20th century, had to be completely rebuilt because of the Tokyo earthquake in 1923. And so it goes. I was surprised by all these things and more. And finally, I was surprised that the vineyard at Seven Hill in South Australia, established in 1851, is the last remaining Jesuit-owned and active winery in the world. So I learned a lot, much more than I could say here. And while the learning itself was a grace, a gift from God in its own way, the greatest grace was the warm human experience, which grew and grew and grew over the time of our working together, while never slacking on the work itself. A grace, too, was the completion of the project, and I guess this is the final grace, the thing in itself. Thank you.
So we've left the time to ask questions. If there are things that you want to know more of, ask any of the contributors and the editors. Please come with your questions or your comments if you want to know what's in the book or what's not. And I'll field them. I try to manage the crowd.
So I really like what you said earlier, Mary, about the challenges and cleavages and the problems. So it sounds like it's good history to not sort of turn a blind eye toward some of the darker episodes in Jesuit history. So how, I guess and I'm not Juana, even though when I was on the pilgrimage, I used to say I wanted a t-shirt that said, I want to be Juana, because I thought she was so cool when I discovered about Juana of Austria. So as a non-Jesuit, was there any kind of feedback that you received from other people within the order who are higher up than you, in terms of in relation to how to tell the story, or people interested, provincial or superior, things like that? In particular, in relation to some of the harder stories, Not censorship, but was there conversations about how are you going to navigate this?
Again, the origin of this had nothing to do with Jesuit hierarchy, nothing whatsoever. It came from Cambridge University Press, which, if you know the history of England and the Reformation, and so it's quite astonishing, actually. So things have changed a lot since the 16th century, to say the least. But no, I did not at any time. I told my own provincial about it. I told him. I didn't ask him anything. I can't think of any point at which anybody attempted to influence it, or most people thought it was a good idea, but they didn't. Yeah. I think some people thought it would never see completion, frankly. I think we've won the battle against the skeptics who thought nothing would happen, that it would be one of those projects that goes on 50 years and then just disappears or something.
You have a great, there's a great introduction, but there's a great introduction where you talk about even the nature, as a cultural historian, thinking about the form itself, the production of an encyclopedia, and the encyclopedia, the original one would have had anti-Jesuit, anti-papist entries in it, and so how you produce this thing, and then occupy the space of having Cambridge produce it, is sort of the ironies of that. And then you talk about choices. And I was wondering, could you talk a little bit about
one of the
how you
issues,
choose what's in and what's out?
What's in and what's out is a huge topic. What matters most about the Jesuits is the way I put it. And that was our early discussions. I would say that was a lot of it. So people could dispute that. I'm sure when their reviews come out, some will say there should be entries on this or that, or there's too much on this and not enough on that. You can't make everyone happy. But we did spend a lot of time on it, kind of what does matter most in telling the story. Cambridge University Press did impose parameters in length. They wanted a one-volume encyclopedia that would be between 350,000 words and 500,000 words. It's 450,000 words, which I thought was at a good point in that range. They seemed very happy with that. So there were definitely parameters. It wasn't going to be forever in length. Some people think encyclopedia means everything is covered. Well, of course, no encyclopedia actually does that. So we don't pretend everything is covered. It's also, the Jesuits are a moving target. There's change every day. I mentioned at one point Jesuit provinces. There have been enormous changes just in the last 10 years, and there will be more changes. So, we could list the current provinces, but that'll be different in 5 years. So, there are things like that we knew we couldn't have everything. Or we couldn't keep, I said at some point we weren't going to keep updating or it would never be printed. We had to have a cut-up date. The cut-up date was essentially August of 2016.
We did have a lot of debate about this.
Certainly.
From my point of view as an art historian, there were long lists of topics I wanted, long lists of artists and artistic projects, and Jeff Kleiber also provided a long list of things related to Latin America. And, I'm sure that you had your own ideas of things that you also wanted covered. And we looked at all of these endless lists and tried to sort of weed them down. So there was a lot of process in deciding what was in and what was out, and just how important things were.
We had to decide on length of entries, too. We went with a tripartite version of 300, 800, and 3,000 as the size of entries, so to keep it manageable. Yes, Darren.
Did you find that as you finished, there were still unfinished areas that you either wished you could get to or didn't know were there until you started?
Well, one of the things we decided on the biographical entries, no one who's still alive could be considered for a biographical entry. You had, at a minimum, to be dead to be considered.
So that's why there's no Francis?
That's why Francis does not have a biography, yes.
But that, that's a follow-up on what I've been thinking, and that is, it almost seems like you're set up to do an updated version.
Could be.
that I was going to ask, like, the 110 entries, one was the last, you answered it, but one was the last determination of those 110.
Yeah.
And so things like the crop exchanges, things like people that have died in the meantime, and then things like some of the things that were left out. Seems like that's the three, not necessarily the three, aspects of content for a follow-up.
Certainly, I would never presume that this is forever the definitive word on the Jesuits. My hope is that it stimulates more research, so not just an updating of this, but other people, including in other languages. One thing we did was we did not do a lot of translating of entries. It's an English language project sponsored by, for Cambridge University Press. The people I work with discourage strongly taking entries in other languages and having them translated. We did make one exception, but only one. Out of the 600 some entries, there's only one that's been translated from another language. So, you know, there's plenty of room for such reference works in French, German, Italian, Japanese, Chinese, etc., etc. But also, yes, in English as time goes on, we'll have an update of this or of others. So I suppose the hope is that it stimulates, some who are aware of what's going on, say you don't need to stimulate this. There is a lot of work going on in Jesuit history. More and more of it by people other than Jesuits themselves. The election of the Jesuits added even more stimulus to something that was already a hot topic. So that's true too. We tried to be, one thing we tried to aim at in bibliographies that accompany the entries is to be up to date, so that if there had to be choices, which items to put in the more recent works, to put in so people be aware of how much has been done, say just in the 21st century already on these topics. And I do see it as a project done in the Papacy of Pope Francis. The entries were commissioned from the fall of 2013, so even if it begun sooner, sort of part of the matter is all within his papacy. I think it's influenced by it in a good way, but 20 or 30 years from now, it will be a different situation.
Many years ago, when I was teaching here, I had signed a few contracts for articles for a publication of American Catholic women. Now, eventually that never came off because they had to withdraw from that.
Yeah.
Did you ever hit a critical point like that?
No. No. With the
And what
grace,
was that due to that you did not?
with the grace of God and hard work. I don't know what else to say, but no. I mean, we could have, but, I mean, what would you say? I mean, there was never any question that that was going to happen.
Right.
But we're strong.
I mean, you know, things happen in academia all the time that are unexpected, but maybe we're just lucky.
Yeah. I don't think there was ever a day, once we commissioned the entries,
Right.
there was no returning after that. I mean, it was going to happen.
We had to, sometimes with commissioned entries, I mean, I lost one of my people. What came in a 3,000-word article, it just wasn't acceptable and wasn't going to be. So later on we had to find somebody for that. And there were other things where you had to adjust, or you had to say, we won't have an article on this. But there was never anything that was going to change the character of the encyclopedia fundamentally. But there were some, like a boat tacking sailing, that we had to move a bit with the actual evolution of things. But I'd say 95% is there of what we hoped would be in the encyclopedia.
I mean, one of the things I learned is it's best to have a lot of younger scholars involved, doctoral students or tenure track folk. They're thrilled to be in the project, for one thing, and they tend to do a fabulous job, and they're very up to date. The more frustration tended to be people sort of my generation and older who didn't really need to be in it and said yes, and then,
Took their sweet
when are we
time.
going to get it, and then it was way too long when it was submitted, and all kinds of things.
But I would also add that the press was incredibly supportive. I mean, it was their idea to begin with, but at every step
I never felt like there was any sort of conflict with what we wanted to do and what the press wanted us to do. I mean, maybe more images, yes, but I mean, like no major conflict. So I think that it went fairly smoothly in that regard, or at least from my point of view.
Some other questions?
I actually have one question, it's very obscure. And I could just as easily look it up. So I won't preface it. Are there any entries on sort of like food or Jesuit forms of celebration or like particular, I just feel like one of the things, I know the polis or the hospitality is their special care, but having spent a lot of time with Jesuits, I feel like at least American Jesuits have a sense of sort of gathering and ritual, like Jesuit ritual and food. Is there anything in there around like food or ritual, other than the vineyard?
Vineyard, certainly.
You know,
It's vineyards literal and metaphorical. The entry is actually vineyards literal and metaphorical.
Yeah.
Okay? Because vineyard is an important image for Ignatius that has to do with the
Right.
apostolate and ministry and so on. So it's that also. But it is also actual vineyards, the remaining one in Australia and so on. There's an entry villa, which for Jesuits is a kind of place to go outside the city for some rest and recreation and so on. That's an entry that might come close to what you have in mind. Is what
Ritual, Jesuit
it's
ritual.
okay. Ritual? You mean a ritual as daily life?
I don't know, I'm thinking houses.
It's liturgy.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
a party.
Yeah, when I think about things like 40 hours devotion, they're more liturgical.
Yeah.
Not
I'm thinking of
necessarily.
social
I can't think of
community
anything
rituals.
specifically that involves food, however. That is maybe
Well, the Eucharist, we have spiritual food.
We have a little on food indirectly when we talk about what Jesuits did in other places, wearing the clothing of others, eating their food, etc. But I mean, I would think that is a little, I'm happy to hear we could have done that and we didn't.
We do have
Because
an
there are foodies today, it's a big thing,
Yeah.
and we didn't think of an article on food.
We do have an entry on asceticism. Father Gavin.
Very short.
Father Gavin in the back is the author of it. That might have to do more with not eating food.
Stephanie, is the question on pre-perennials?
No, it's just, and I'm not trying to be Western focused either, you know, but just this idea about community building and being in the world, you know,
Well, community we
God
certainly
and
have.
being at the table with
Yeah.
people, both in community and then
Yeah.
creating community with people. It just seems like food is a
Yeah.
measure of that exchange, you know, and that coming together.
I mean, certainly we have a lot on community
Yeah.
in various entries. Yeah.
I think, no, the passage on dance, I think, is interesting, not only for thinking about dance within Europe, but also dance in these missions, and which would have some other connection, but I don't remember reading it. But I thought like the choice of thinking about what to include. I didn't read the one on science fiction, but now I'm going to go and find it. That's what I want to hear, now about. But there's on television and film, or when you read these things, well, then you see this, you realize that it's, the medium was really important, the message, that they had this sense of adapting to the times in order to reach people where they were. And I wouldn't have expected television, but then after reading it, that makes sense.
Sure.
Some questions last questions to wrap up? Well, we can continue the conversation as this ends. I want to thank the guests for traveling. All of our guests had to travel here. And I want to thank you for coming out and for our other contributors for being here. And let's end the night for now.